The Rockery by E.G. Swain and read by Christopher Halton. Good evening and welcome to Haunted Tales of Darkness. Ancient warnings are often dismissed as little more than superstition, a weathered inscription, an old stake driven deep into the earth, a forgotten chain buried beneath a quiet garden. Yet sometimes those who left such warnings behind knew precisely what they were doing. Tonight's story, The Rockery, was first published in 1927 in the Stoneground Ghost Tales by Ernest Benn Limited of London. Once again, E.G. Swain draws upon his intimate knowledge of English parish life, blending history, folklore and the supernatural with extraordinary subtlety. As Mr Batchel undertakes what seems to be an innocent improvement to his beloved garden, he unwittingly disturbs something that has lain undisturbed for more than 2 centuries. The consequences soon extend far beyond the boundaries of Stoneground itself. So dim the lights, settle back and join me for another forgotten masterpiece of classic supernatural fiction. The Vicar's garden at Stoneground has certainly been enclosed for more than 7 centuries, and during the whole of that time its almost sacred privacy has been regarded as permanent and unchangeable. It has remained for the innovators of later and more audacious days to hint that it might be given into other hands, and still carry with it no curse that should make a new possessor hasten to undo his irreverence. Whether there can be warrant for such confidence, time will show. The experiences already related will show that the privacy of the garden has been counted upon both by good men and worse. And here is a story in its way more strange than any. By way of beginning, it may be well to describe a part of the garden not hitherto brought into notice. That part lies on the western boundary, where the garden slopes down to a sluggish stream, hardly a stream at all, locally known as the Lode. The Lode bounds the garden on the west along its whole length, and there the moorhen builds her nest, and the kingfisher is sometimes, but in these days too rarely, seen. But the centre of vision, as it were, of this western edge lies in a cluster of tall elms. Towards these all the garden paths converge, and about their base is raised a bank of earth, upon which is heaped a rockery of large stones lately overgrown with ferns. Mr Batchel's somewhat prim taste in gardening had long resented this disorderly bank. In more than one place in his garden had wild confusion given place to a park-like trimness, and there were not a few who would say that the change was not for the better. Mr Batchel, however, went his own way, and in due time determined to remove the rockery. He was puzzled by its presence. He could see no reason why a bank should have been raised about the feet of the elms and surmounted with stones. Not a ray of sunshine ever found its way there, and none but coarse and uninteresting plants had established themselves. Whoever had raised the bank had done it ignorantly or with some purpose not easy for Mr Batchel to conjecture. Upon a certain day, therefore, in the early part of December, when the garden had been made comfortable for its winter rest, he began, with the assistance of his gardener, to remove the stones into another place. We do but speak according to custom in this matter, and there are few readers who will not suspect the truth, which is that the gardener began to remove the stones whilst Mr Batchel stood by and delivered criticisms of very slight value. Such strength, in fact, as Mr Batchel possessed had concentrated itself upon the mind, and somewhat neglected his body, and what he called help during his presence in the garden was called by another name when the gardener and his boy were left to themselves with full freedom of speech. There were few of the stones rolled down by the gardener that Mr Batchel could even have moved, but his astonishment at their sight soon gave place to excitement at their appearance. His antiquarian tastes were strong and was soon busily engaged, for as the stones rolled down, His eyes were feasted in a rapid succession by capitals of columns, fragments of moulded arches and mullions, and other relics of ecclesiastical building. Repeatedly he did call the gardener down from his work to put these fragments together, and before long there were several complete lengths of arcading laid upon the path. Stones which perhaps had been separated for centuries once more came together, and Mr Batchel, rubbing his hands in excited satisfaction, declared that he might recover the best parts of a church by the time the Rockery had been demolished. The interest of the gardener in such matters was of a milder kind. "We must go careful," he merely observed, "when we come to the organ." They went on removing more and more stones, until at length the whole bank was laid bare, and Mr Batchel's chief purpose achieved. How the stones were carefully arranged and set up in other parts of the garden is well known, and need not concern us now. One detail, however, must not be omitted. A large and stout stake of yew, evidently of considerable age, but nevertheless quite sound, stood exposed after the clearing of the bank. There was no obvious reason for its presence, but it had been well driven in, so well that the strength of the gardener, or if it made any difference, of the gardener and Mr Batchel together, failed even to shake it. It was not unsightly, and might have remained where it was had not the gardener exclaimed, "This is the very thing we want for the pump." It was so obviously the very thing that its removal was then and there decided upon. The pump referred to was a small iron pump used to draw water from the lode. It had been affixed to many posts in turn, and defied them all to hold it. Not that the pump was at fault. It was a trifling affair enough. But the pumpers were usually garden boys whose impatient energy had never failed, before many days, to wriggle the pump away from its supports. When the gardener had upon one occasion spent half a day in attaching it firmly to a post, they had at once shaken out the post itself. Since therefore the matter was causing daily inconvenience, and the gardener becoming daily more concerned for his reputation as a rough carpenter, it was natural for him to exclaim, "This is the very thing." It was a better stake than he had ever used, and, as had just been made evident, a stake that the ground would hold. "Yes," said Mr Batchel, "it is the very thing, but can we get it up?" The gardener always accepted this kind of query as a challenge, and replied only by taking up a pick and setting to work, Mr Batchel, as usual, looking on, and making, every now and then, a fruitless suggestion. After a few minutes, however, he made somewhat more than a suggestion. He darted forward and laid his hand upon the pick. "Don't you see some copper?" he asked quickly. Every man who digs knows what a hiding place there is in the earth. The monotony of spade work is always relieved by a hope of turning up something unexpected. Treasure lies dimly behind all these hopes, so that the gardener, having seen Mr Batchel excited over so much that was precious from his own point of view, was quite ready to look for something of value to an ordinary reasonable man. Copper might lead to silver, and that in turn to gold. At Mr Batchel's eager question, therefore, he peered into the hole he had made, and examined everything there that might suggest the rounded form of a coin. He soon saw what had arrested Mr Batchel. There was a lustrous scratch on the side of the stake, evidently made by the pick, and though the metal was copper plainly enough, the gardener felt that he had been deceived and would have gone on with his work. Copper of that sort gave him no sort of excitement, and only a feeble interest. Mr Batchel, however, was on his hands and knees. There was a small irregular plate of copper nailed to the stake. Without any difficulty he tore it away from the nails, and soon scraped it clean with a shaving of wood. Then, rising to his feet, he examined his find. There was an inscription upon it so legible as to need no deciphering. It had been roughly and effectually made with a hammer and nail, the letters being formed by series of holes punched deeply into the metal, and what he read was, "Move not this stake November 1st, 1702." But to move the stake was what Mr Batchel had determined upon, and the metal plate he held in his hand interested him chiefly as showing how long the post had been there. He had happened, as he supposed, upon an ancient landmark. The discovery recorded elsewhere of a well near to the edge of his present lawn had shown him that his premises had once been differently arranged. One of the minor antiquarian tasks he had set himself was to discover and record the old arrangement, and he felt that the position of this stake would help him. He felt no doubt of its being a point upon the western limit of the garden, not improbably marked in this way to show where the garden began and where ended the ancient hauling way, which had been secured to the public for purposes of navigation. The gardener, meanwhile, was proceeding with his work. With no small difficulty he removed the rubble and clay which accounted for the firmness of the stake. It grew dark as the work went on, and a distant clock struck 5 before it was completed. 5 was the hour at which the gardener usually went home. His day began early. He was not, however, a man to leave a small job unfinished, and he went on loosening the earth with his pick and trying the effect at intervals upon the firmness of the stake. It naturally began to give, and could be moved from side to side through a space of some few inches. He lifted out the loosened stones and loosened more. His pick struck iron, which after loosening proved to be links of a rusted chain. "They've buried a lot of rubbish in this hole," he remarked as he went on loosening the chain, which in the growing darkness could hardly be seen. Mr Batchel, meanwhile, occupied himself in a simpler task of working the stake to and fro by way of loosening its hold. Ultimately it began to move with greater freedom. The gardener laid down his tool and grasped the stake, which his master was still holding. Their combined efforts succeeded at once. The stake was lifted out. It turned out to be furnished with an unusually long and sharp point, which explained the firmness of its hold upon the ground. The gardener carried it to the neighbourhood of the pump, in readiness for its next purpose, and made ready to go home. He would drive the stake tomorrow, he said, in the new place, and make the pump so secure that not even the boys could shake it. He also spoke of some designs he had upon the chain, should it prove to be of any considerable length. He was an ingenious man, and his skill in converting discarded articles to new uses was embarrassing to his master. Mr Batchel, as has been said, was a prim gardener, and he had no liking for makeshift devices. He had that day seen his runner beans trained upon a length of old gas piping, and had no intention of leaving the gardener in possession of such a treasure as a rusty chain. What he said, however, and said with truth, was that he wanted the chain for himself. He had no practical use for it, and hardly expected it to yield him any interest. But a chain buried in 1702 must be examined. Nothing ancient comes amiss to a man of antiquarian tastes. Mr Batchel had noticed, whilst the gardener had been carrying away the stake, that the chain lay very loosely in the earth. The pick had worked well round it. He said, therefore, that the chain must be lifted out and brought to him upon the morrow, bade his gardener good night, and went in to his fireside. This will appear to the reader to be a record of the merest trifles, but all readers will accept the reminder that there is no such thing as a trifle, and that what appears to be trivial has that appearance only so long as it stands alone. Regarded in the light of their consequences, those matters which have seemed to be least in importance turn out often enough to be the greatest. And these trifling occupations, as we may call them for the last time of Mr Batchel and the gardener, had consequences which shall now be set down as Mr Batchel himself narrated them. But we must take events in their order. At present Mr Batchel is at his fireside, and his gardener at home with his family. The stake is removed, and the hole, in which lies some sort of an iron chain, is exposed. Upon this particular evening Mr Batchel was dining out. He was a good-natured man with certain mild powers of entertainment, and his presence as an occasional guest was not unacceptable at some of the more considerable houses of the neighbourhood. And let us hasten to observe that he was not a guest who made any great impression upon the larders or the cellars of his hosts. He liked port, but he liked it only of good quality, and in small quantity. When he returned from a dinner party, therefore, he was never either in a surfeited condition of body or in any confusion of mind. Not uncommonly after his return upon such occasions did he perform accurate work. Unfinished contributions to sundry local journals were seldom absent from his desk. They were his means of recreation. There they awaited convenient intervals of leisure, and Mr Batchel was accustomed to say that of these intervals he found none so productive as a late hour or hour and a half after a dinner party. Upon the evening in question he returned about an hour before midnight, from dining at the house of a retired officer residing in the neighbourhood, and the evening had been somewhat less enjoyable than usual. He had taken into dinner a young lady who had too persistently assailed him with antiquarian questions. Now Mr Batchel did not like talking what he regarded as shop, and was not much at home with young ladies to whom he knew that, in the nature of things, he could be but imperfectly acceptable. With infinite goodwill towards them, and a genuine liking for their presence, he felt that he had but little to offer them in exchange. There was so little in common between his life and theirs. He felt distinctly at his worst when he found himself treated as a mere scrapbook of information. It made him seem, as he would express it, dehumanized. Upon this particular evening, the young lady allotted to him, perhaps at her own request, had made a scrapbook of him, and he had returned home somewhat discontented, if also somewhat amused. His discontent arose from having been deprived of the general conversation he so greatly but so rarely enjoyed. His amusement was caused by the incongruity between a very light-hearted young lady and the subject upon which she had made him talk, for she had talked of nothing else but modes of burial. He began to recall the conversation as he lit his pipe and dropped into his armchair. She had either been reflecting deeply upon the matter, or, as seemed to Mr Batchel, more probable, had read something and half forgotten it. He recalled her questions and the answers by which he had vainly tried to lead her to a more attractive topic. For example, she, "Will you tell me why people were buried at crossroads?" He, "Well, consecrated ground was so jealously guarded that a criminal would be held to have forfeited the right to be buried amongst Christian folk. His friends would therefore choose crossroads where there was set a wayside cross and make his grave at the foot of it. In some of my journeys in Scotland I have seen crosses." But the young lady had refused to be led into Scotland. She had stuck to her subject. She, "Why have coffins come back into use? There is nothing in our burial service about a coffin." He, "True, and the use of the coffin is due in part to an ignorant notion of confining the corpse, lest, like Hamlet's father, he should walk the earth. You will have noticed that the corpse is always carried out of the house feet foremost to suggest a final exit, and that the grave is often covered with a heavy slab. Very curious epitaphs are to be found on these slabs." But she was not to be drawn into the subject of epitaphs. She had made him tell of other devices for confining spirits to their prison and securing the peace of the living, especially of those adopted in the case of violent and mischievous men. Altogether an unusual sort of young lady, the conversation, however, had revived his memories of what was, after all, a matter of some interest, and he determined to look through his parish registers for records of exceptional burials. He was surprised at himself for never having done it. He dismissed the matter from his mind for the time being, and as it was a bright moonlight night, he thought he would finish his pipe in the garden. Therefore, although midnight was close at hand, he strolled complacently round his garden, enjoying the light of the moon, no less than in the daytime he would have enjoyed the sun. And thus it was that he arrived at the scene of his labours upon the old rockery. There was more light than there had been at the end of the afternoon, and when he had walked up the bank and stood over the hole we have already described, he could distinctly see the few exposed links of the iron chain. Should he remove it at once to a place of safety, out of the way of the gardener? It was about time for bed. The city clocks were then striking midnight. He would let the chain decide. If it came out easily, he would remove it. Otherwise, it should remain until morning. The chain came out more than easily. It seemed to have a force within itself. He gave but a slight tug at the free end with a view of ascertaining what resistance he had to encounter, and immediately found himself lying upon his back with the chain in his hand. His back had fortunately turned towards an elm 3 feet away which broke his fall, but there had been violence enough to cause him no little surprise. The effort he had made was so slight that he could not account for having lost his feet, and being a careful man, he was a little anxious about his evening coat, which he was still wearing. The chain, however, was in his hand, and he made haste to coil it into a portable shape, and to return to the house. Some 50 yards from the spot was the northern boundary of the garden, a long wall with a narrow lane beyond. It was not unusual, even at this hour of the night, to hear footsteps there. The lane was used by railway men who passed to and from their work at all hours, as also by some who returned late from entertainments in the neighbouring city. But Mr Batchel, as he turned back to the house, with his chain over one arm, heard more than footsteps. He heard for a few moments the unmistakable sound of a scuffle, and then a piercing cry, loud and sharp, and a noise of running. It was such a cry as could only have come from one in urgent need of help. Mr Batchel dropped his chain. The garden wall was some 10 feet high, and he had no means of scaling it, but he ran quickly into the house, passed out by the hall door into the street, and so towards the lane without a moment's loss of time. Before he has gone many yards, he sees a man running from the lane with his clothing in great disorder, and this man, at the sight of Mr Batchel, darts across the road, runs along in the shadow of an opposite wall and attempts to escape. The man is known well enough to Mr Batchel. It is one Stephen Med, a respectable and sensible man, by occupation a shunter, and Mr Batchel at once calls out to ask what has happened. Stephen, however, makes no reply but continues to run along the shadow of the wall, whereupon Mr Batchel crosses over and intercepts him, and again asks what is amiss. Stephen answers wildly and breathlessly, "I'm not going to stop here, let me go home." As Mr Batchel lays his hand upon the man's arm and draws him into the light of the moon, it is seen that his face is streaming with blood from a wound near the eye. He is somewhat calmed by the familiar voice of Mr Batchel, and is about to speak when another scream is heard from the lane. The voice is that of a boy or woman, and no sooner does Stephen hear it than he frees himself violently from Mr Batchel and makes away towards his home. With no less speed does Mr Batchel make for the lane, and finds about halfway down a boy lying on the ground wounded and terrified. At first the boy clings to the ground, but he too is soon reassured by Mr Batchel's voice, and allows himself to be lifted onto his feet. His wound is also in the face, and Mr Batchel takes the boy into his house, bathes and plasters his wound, and soon restores him to something like calm. He is what is termed a call boy, employed by the railway company to awaken drivers at all hours and give them their instructions. Mr Batchel is naturally impatient for the moment he can question the boy about his assailant, who is presumably also the assailant of Stephen Med. No one had been visible in the lane, though the moon shone upon it from end to end. At the first available moment, therefore, he asked the boy, "Who did this?" The answer came, without any hesitation, "Nobody." "There was nobody there," he said, "and all of a sudden somebody hit me with an iron thing." Then Mr. Batchel asked, "Did you see Stephen Med?" He was becoming greatly puzzled. The boy replied that he had seen Mr. Med a good bit in front, with nobody near him, and that all of a sudden someone knocked him down. Further questioning seemed useless. Mr. Batchel saw the boy to his home, left him at the door, and returned to bed, but not to sleep. He could not cease from thinking, and he could think of nothing but assaults from invisible hands. Morning seemed long in coming, but came at last. Mr. Batchel was up betimes and made a very poor breakfast. Dallying with the morning paper rather than reading it, his eye was arrested by a headline about mysterious assaults in Elmham. He felt that he had mysteries of his own to occupy him, and was in no mood to be interested in more assaults. But he had some knowledge of Elmham, a small town 10 miles distant from Stoneground, and he read the brief paragraph, which contained no more than the substance of a telegram. It said, however, that 3 persons had been victims of unaccountable assaults. 2 of them had escaped with slight injuries, but the third, a young woman, was dangerously wounded, though still alive and conscious. She declared that she was quite alone in her house, and had been suddenly struck with great violence by what felt like a piece of iron, and that she must have bled to death but for a neighbour who heard her cries. The neighbour had at once looked out and seen nobody, but had bravely gone to her friend's assistance. Mr. Batchel laid down his newspaper, considerably impressed, as was natural, by the resemblance of these tragedies to what he had witnessed himself. He was in no condition, after his excitement and his sleepless night, to do his usual work. His mind reverted to the conversation at the dinner party and the trifle of antiquarian research it had suggested. Such occupation had often served him when he found himself suffering from a cold or otherwise indisposed for more serious work. He would get the registers and collect what entries there might be of irregular burial. He found only one such entry, but that one was enough. There was a note dated All Hallows 1702 to this effect: "This day did a vagrant from Elmham beat cruelly to death 2 poor men who had refused him alms, and upon a hue and cry being raised, took his own life. He was buried in one parson's close, with a stake through his body and his arms, confined in chains, and stoutly covered in." No further news came from Elmham. Either the effort had been exhausted, or its purpose achieved. But what could have led the young lady, a stranger to Mr. Batchel, and to his garden, to hit upon so appropriate a topic? Mr. Batchel could not answer the question as he put it to himself again and again during the day. He only knew that she had given him a warning by which, to his shame and regret, he had been too obtuse to profit. The end. Thank you for listening to The Rockery by E.G. Swain. Few writers understood better than Swain that the most frightening ghosts are not always those we see, but those we scarcely glimpse at all. In this remarkable tale, the horror lies not in a monstrous apparition, but in the quiet realization that some ancient precautions existed for a very good reason, and that disturbing them can awaken forces long forgotten. Drawing upon English folklore, antiquarian tradition, and his own experience as a country clergyman, Swain created ghost stories that continue to reward careful readers nearly a century after they were first published. If you enjoyed this story, you'll find many more forgotten classics here on Haunted Tales of Darkness, where I continue to preserve the finest supernatural fiction of the Victorian, Edwardian, and early 20th century, alongside the occasional original tale inspired by those enduring traditions. If you would like to support the channel, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing this video with fellow lovers of classic ghost stories. Until next time, thank you for listening. For several years, I've devoted myself to creating original ghost stories, strange tales, atmospheric narrations, and supernatural fiction through haunted tales of darkness. What many people perhaps do not realize is the amount of work involved behind the scenes, the writing, editing, research, recording, artwork, publishing, and production that goes into trying to create something worthy of the great tradition of classic supernatural storytelling. I continue to do it because I genuinely love the work. Some months ago, however, YouTube effectively removed my ability to earn revenue from the channel, claiming that my content was somehow inauthentic. I was far from alone in this, as many other readers, writers, and narration channels were similarly affected. Ironically, this has happened at a time when the platform itself is increasingly flooded with AI-generated material. Part of the issue, I suspect, is that YouTube strongly favors midstream advertising, which is completely at odds with the kind of immersive storytelling experience I try to create. Interrupting a ghost story midway through with loud advertising breaks the atmosphere and destroys the flow for both reader and listener alike. A number of people have asked whether there is another way to support the channel and my writing directly, and that would be by supporting me through Patreon for anyone who wishes to help support future stories, books, narrations, and projects. There is absolutely no obligation, of course. Watching, listening, commenting, and sharing the work already helps enormously. But for those who would like to contribute monthly or simply leave the occasional gift of support, it would be deeply appreciated and would directly help me continue creating new material. Thank you to everyone who has followed and supported Haunted Tales of Darkness over the years.